Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We're about to jump into a deep dive that, and I'm not exaggerating it really reorients how you think about life itself.
Yeah.
It challenges these metaphors we've been using for, what, centuries?
Oh, absolutely. This is the kind of research that it forces you to completely reevaluate everything. Basic concepts, like intelligence, agency, what it even means for something to be a coherent, living thing.
And we're talking about the Multi-Scale Competency Architecture, the MCA.
That's the one. Primarily from Michael Levin and his lab. It's just groundbreaking stuff.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to find the intellectual shortcut right to the core of this framework. We want to move past that passive view of biology that, frankly, most of us got in high school.
Right. The idea that life is just a fixed script being played out.
Exactly. For generations, the main metaphor, whether we said it out loud or not, was the clockwork machine.
A cold, deterministic device.
Yeah.
And then in the computer age, that just got an update. The organism became a computer.
Where DNA is this rigid, passive program.
And the cells are they're just hardware. They're obedient, unthinking execution units that just follow the code. They're cogs.
And the MCA, which is based on decades of real experimental proof, it just throws all of that out.
Completely. It proposes a revolutionary shift. It says that life is organized not just structurally, cells and tissues,
right,
but functionally. It's organized into these nested layers of intelligent agents.
Agents. I mean, we're talking about biological parts that are capable of autonomous problem solving.
Without a central command, they're not just bricks waiting to be placed. They are, in their own domain, decentralized experts.
And the whole theory seems to rest on this one really precise, really powerful word, competency.
It's the key.
Yeah.
And it's not just a fancy word for complexity. In this context, scientifically, philosophically, competency is defined as the ability to reach a specific goal.
A goal. Or what mathematicians would call an attractor.
An attractor, exactly. And to reach it despite noise, despite novel problems, despite things changing all around you.
I think we need to ground that term, attractor, right away. Because in physics, an attractor is a state that a system just sort of evolves towards. How should you, our listener, picture this biologically?
The best analogy is a landscape. Think of a valley in a mountain range. The attractor is the lowest point in that valley. It's the point of maximum stability.
Okay.
Now, it doesn't matter where you drop a marble on the sides of that valley, and the marble here is the developing tissue or a cell. It's going to roll down toward that lowest, most stable point.
And the marble doesn't need a map.
It doesn't need a map. It doesn't need step-by-step instructions. The shape, the very topology of the landscape itself guides it to the goal.
And that detail, the ability to get to the goal despite being dropped far from the perfect starting point, that seems to be the critical signature of agency.
It is. If you have a passive clockwork machine and you break a piece or put it in the wrong spot, the machine either stops or it fails in a very predictable, fixed way.
But with a competent, intelligent agent.
It's different. It perceives the error, it sees the gap between where it is and where the attractor is, and it dynamically finds a new path around the obstacle to get to the outcome.
So that self-correction, that goal-directed robustness, that's what the MCA is really trying to explain.
Exactly. The machine isn't just a solution. It's a machine that has evolved to solve problems.
Okay, so let's really dig into the philosophical weight here. I mean, this is a huge shift. It requires us to completely reject the idea that our cells and tissues are just passive hardware.
They're not just sitting there waiting for instructions from the nucleus.
They have their own inherent built-in capacity for solving problems.
Tailored specifically to the scale they operate at. And that means, biological systems are fundamentally intentional systems. They are directed toward a goal, even if they don't have consciousness like we do.
The term that I just find so compelling here is agential matter.
It's a great term.
It's matter that makes decisions. It's matter that navigates a space to get to a goal. And that idea, I think, is what lets you start seeing biology as a form of collective intelligence.
It is. And when we say agential matter, we're talking about systems that show this persistent, directed behavior, even without a brain or a nervous system. Think about a single-celled organism, like an amoeba.
Okay.
You put a drop of toxin near it, it doesn't have a command center to consult. It immediately starts complex internal defense mechanisms. It changes how it moves. It tries to get away from the threat.
It's solving the problem of staying alive.
Exactly, through its own sophisticated autonomous action.
But, okay, if we accept that premise, it immediately brings up a huge question, one I'm sure you, the listener, are already thinking about. If every cell Every tissue is its own autonomous agent. Doesn't that risk total biological anarchy?
Right. What stops it from all just falling apart into chaos?
If a cell is only solving its own local problem, what keeps the whole organism together?
That is the essential puzzle. And the answer, according to the MCA, is in the nested nature of the competency.
So it's not just a structural hierarchy.
No, it's a functional one. The cell solves cellular level problems, but those problems exist within the boundaries set by the tissue.
And the tissue solves geometric problems.
While the whole body solves survival problems in the real world, the goals are nested. So a lower level agent's freedom is sort of constrained and guided by the higher level agent's main objective.
So every level of organization, from gene networks all the way up to organ systems, is its own agent, but it has its own unique problem space.
Exactly. And the reason you don't get anarchy is because the higher levels don't control things by micromanaging. They do it by setting the global incentive structure. They deform the energy landscape, which is a concept we'll get into.
They make it locally beneficial for the little guy to do what helps the big guy.
You've got it. That's a perfect way to put it.
And this framework, it just provides such an elegant explanation for biological robustness, which, as you said, was always the big weakness of the old clockwork model.
The Achilles heel, for sure. If the parts are dumb and they're just following a fixed script, any tiny bit of noise, any small deviation should cause a total system failure.
But it doesn't. Life persists, it regenerates, it adapts with this incredible resilience.
Take the flatworm, you can cut it in half, you can cut it into a dozen pieces. Each piece regenerates a full, perfectly proportioned worm.
So the cells aren't following a script that says, if you're at coordinate XYZ, build a head.
No. They're acting as a collective intelligence that recognizes, hey, we're missing a head. They see the error and they coordinate to regenerate the target final form. This ability to handle massive damage and still self-correct. That's direct evidence of decentralized competency.
So the robustness we see in biology, the ability of a tissue to regrow, or for an embryo to perfectly compensate for missing cells, that's not some special, expensive add-on that evolution came up with.
No, it's the inherent, necessary result of building a complex system out of autonomous, self-correcting parts. It's what you should expect when you build with agential matter.
So this is a really crucial takeaway for you, the listener. Biological persistence, it's rooted in the decentralized intelligence of its own components. The system is anti-fragile because its parts are not passive slaves.
They're active, collaborating problem solvers.
Okay, so that leads us perfectly to the next part of the framework. We have to map out these actual landscapes the agents are navigating. If competency is all about moving towards an attractor, we need to know the geography of those attractors.
Right, and this is where the MCA really lays out its functional hierarchy. It defines 4 distinct problem spaces that these biological agents are operating in.
And they go from the most granular, sort of the chemical space inside a single cell, all the way up to the 3D world the whole animal lives in.
Exactly. And each space requires a different kind of agent, solving a totally unique set of problems.
So let's start at the bottom, at the foundational chemical level. This is transcriptional space.
Right. And here, the agents are the gene regulatory networks, these incredibly intricate networks of genes and proteins that govern their own expression.
And their problem is purely chemical and informational.
Purely. They have to adjust their expression levels in real time to keep the cell's internal environment balanced, what we call homeostasis, even when things outside and inside are fluctuating like crazy.
So their goal, their attractor, is this perfect dynamic equilibrium of protein production.
That's it, homeostatic expression.
Can you give us an example? What's a problem that gets solved in transcriptional space?
Sure. Let's say a cell is suddenly under stress, maybe a drop in oxygen or a spike in temperature. The gene network agents, they instantly recognize this shift as an error. It's a deviation from their ideal homeostatic attractor.
And they don't need an external command.
No. They immediately trigger things like heat shock proteins, where they activate pathways to shift metabolism, and they navigate this complex chemical landscape to get back to that stable, ideal state. Their intelligence is all about maintaining internal chemical viability.
Okay, so moving up one level, we get to physiological space.
Right. And here, the agents are individual cells, or maybe small, very connected networks of cells.
And their problem is more complex than just gene expression.
Much more complex. This is about managing the critical internal metrics that keep the cell alive within these really strict, non-negotiable ranges. This is where the cell is acting as an electrical and an osmotic agent.
So we're talking about things like ion concentrations, the voltage across the cell membrane, pH levels.
All of that. The primary competencies here are managing those things precisely.
What's the real practical difference between a problem here and a problem in transcriptional space?
Transcriptional agents solve the problem of supplying the tools for survival making the right proteins at the right time.
Okay.
Physiological agents solve the problem of using those tools to maintain the internal environment. So, for example, if you eat a really salty meal, the physiological agents in your kidney cells have to deal with a huge change in osmotic pressure.
Right, they can't just burst or shrink.
Exactly. So they immediately use the tools, the ion channels and pumps that the transcriptional agents provided, to actively manage water and salt, keeping everything in that narrow band of viability. That's their goal state.
Okay, now we take a huge leap. We're moving into the space that I think holds the most counterintuitive, almost shocking evidence for this whole idea, anatomical space, or morphospace.
This is the big one. This is the scale of tissues and organs acting together as collaborating agents.
And their goal is geometry.
A target geometry, yes. The attractor here is the final, perfect anatomical structure, the ideal shape of a kidney, the correct placement of an eye, a fully formed limb. When we talk about collective intelligence in biology, this is where you can really see it.
So let's drill down on that. If the goal is a specific shape, how does the collective of cells know that shape? Where is that target represented?
This is where the idea of an electrical blueprint becomes so important. The collective of cells is acting like a distributed computer. It perceives its current state, it compares that to the target state, the blueprint, the attractor, and it calculates an error signal.
And then it acts to minimize that error.
Exactly. The cells aren't just following a sequence, they're following a gradient that leads them toward that stable geometric minimum.
And the classic mind-blowing evidence for this is regulative development.
It's just such a powerful demonstration. Think about an early amphibian embryo. They're studied for this because their regenerative abilities are just incredible.
Right.
If you surgically rearrange the cells that are supposed to become eye tissue and the cells that are supposed to become limb tissue,
So you mix them up.
you mix them up completely. The cells don't just blindly develop into eyes in the wrong place and limbs in the wrong place. They actively migrate, sometimes over huge distances, correcting for that initial mess, and they eventually produce a normal animal.
So the collective tissue agent is doing two incredible things. One, it's perceiving an error against a global template.
Yes.
And two, it's competent enough to choose a brand new developmental path, a path that was never programmed to follow to get to that goal.
It's not just following step 1, step 2, step 3. It is dynamically course-correcting toward a known outcome. And that ability is almost impossible to explain with the old model of passive cells following a fixed, linear script. It really suggests the DNA provides the list of parts.
The building materials and the workers.
Right, but the architectural blueprint itself is maintained and implemented by the collective intelligence of the cells.
Okay, so finally we get to the top layer, behavioral space.
And this is the highest level, the one we're most familiar with. The agents here are whole organisms.
And the problem space is the macroscopic, three-dimensional world we live in.
Correct. The attractor states are the big survival outcomes: finding food, avoiding predators, reproducing. This kind of intelligence, which we usually associate with the central nervous system, is just the highest, most visible layer of the whole MCA hierarchy.
It's such a compelling structure. It explained how you manage all this complexity without some kind of organizational overload.
Exactly. You decentralize the intelligence. You tailor it to the scale of the challenge. Chemical agents solve chemical problems. Geometric agents solve spatial problems.
And that avoids the computational explosion that would happen if one central brain had to micromanage the protein production of every single cell in your body.
It's ultimate efficiency through modularity. You set the goals locally, and as long as the higher level signals are right, local optimization contributes perfectly to global optimization. It's the ultimate distributed control system.
Which brings us to what I find to be the most intellectually challenging but also the most fascinating part of this whole framework.
Okay.
We've established these independent, competent agents. How on earth do they coordinate? If they're all just solving local problems, there has to be some kind of cognitive glue that links the layers together without needing a massive central computer.
That is the central paradox of coordination. If everything has agency, how does the whole body stay coherent? And the MCA proposes that the whole maintains control over the parts, not through top-down commands, but through two very efficient, very clever distributed mechanisms.
Okay, so let's start with mechanism A, deforming the energy landscape. We've used the valley analogy, but we need to really ground this in the biology.
Right. The analogy is a good starting point, but the mechanism is incredible. The higher-level agents, like tissues, they don't send detailed micromanagement orders down to the cells.
You're not giving them a GPS route?
No. Instead, they use these global physical and chemical signals to basically structure the environment. They deform the energy landscape for all their subunits.
Okay, so how does a tissue actually do that? How does it manipulate the local environment to make one path easier for a cell than another?
It's primarily through bioelectrical signals and chemical gradients. For example, you can have specific electrical potentials maintained across a sheet of cells, and that can make moving in one direction require much less metabolic energy. It's a lower energy barrier than moving in another direction.
Okay. So the environment itself becomes uneven.
Exactly. The higher level isn't commanding the cell to move. It's just making the desired path the path of least resistance. It's setting the global incentive structure.
Right. So if a cell is designed to seek stability, and the tissue-level agent creates a gradient that says stability is over here at coordinate X, then the competent cell will just naturally go to X.
Precisely. The collective agent ensures that when a lower-level agent does what is locally easiest or best for itself, like following an electrical gradient, it simultaneously contributes perfectly to the global goal of the whole tissue.
And that just bypasses the need for massive computation and constant feedback loops.
It's why the system is so robust. You don't need a perfect central controller. You just need the landscape to be set up correctly, and the competency of the subunits handles the rest of the problem solving.
And that leads us straight into mechanism B, bioelectricity, as the high-level software.
And this, I think, is the most revolutionary and counterintuitive part of the whole theory. It really demands that we rethink where biological information is even stored, separate from the genome.
So we're not talking about brain activity here. We're talking about non-neural bioelectric networks.
Yeah.
Electrical potentials across cell membranes in tissues like your skin, your liver, your gut.
Right, and they're acting as a high-level cognitive layer.
How is that different from what the brain does?
The nervous system uses electrical signals for super-fast data transmission. But here, in these non-neural networks, they use stable, sustained voltage patterns across the cell's VMEM potentials, not for transmission, but for information storage and pattern regulation.
It's the software layer.
It's the software layer. That is the perfect analogy. The DNA is the hardware. It builds the ion channels and the pumps.
But the actual voltage state, the specific electrical pattern that's maintained across the cells by those pumps, that's the software. That's the informational blueprint.
That's the idea. The voltage pattern across the tissue serves as this dynamic informational template. It's the goal state in Morphospace. If the voltage pattern says build a hand, the individual cells, as competent agents, collaborate until their physical structure matches that electrical structure.
The implication of that is just huge. If the goal template is electrical and informational and not hard-coded in the genomic hardware,
then you should be able to manipulate it.
right. Researchers should be able to change that goal state and get a completely different output, even with the exact same DNA.
And this is exactly what the experiments show. By using drugs that specifically target those ion channels, researchers can change the overall electrical pattern of a tissue. They are, effectively, rewriting the tissue's high-level goal.
Okay, walk us through one of the most striking examples of this.
The big one involves Xenopus, the African clawed frog, in its embryo stage. Researchers took cells that were genetically fated to become the animal's gut.
So gut cells, nothing special.
Gut cells. The genetic hardware was totally normal. They had all the genes to build gut tissue. But the researchers changed the electrical template, the high-level software, to match the pattern for an eye.
And what happened?
The collective of gut cells was persuaded to reorganize, they collaborated, and they built a fully functional ectopic eye on the flank of the tadpole.
Wait, an eye built by gut cells, just because the electrical template was changed.
It's a stunning separation of form and function from the genome. It proves that the goal state is plastic, it's manipulable, and it exists as this separate, high-level informational layer.
This isn't genetic engineering.
Not at all. This is cognitive engineering at the tissue level. It confirms that distinction perfectly. DNA provides the hardware components, but the bioelectric network provides the high-level geometric information, the software that guides the collective intelligence.
Theory is one thing, but that experiment is just It's incredible. But we need to anchor this idea of collective intelligence with what might be the most vivid piece of evidence out there, the story of the Picasso tadpole.
This experiment is foundational. It's a direct head-to-head test between the old fixed script model and this new competent agent model right there in anatomical space. The subjects were, again, Xenopus laevi's tadpoles.
So describe the setup. What did they do to really break the clockwork machine?
They took very early-stage tadpoles and did microsurgery to completely scramble the placement of the cells that would eventually form the face and jaw.
Scramble them.
Imagine taking a completed puzzle, picking up all the pieces that form the face, shaking them in your hand, and just putting them back randomly in the wrong spots. That's what they did.
Okay, so under the old passive fixed script model, the result should have been a disaster.
A total disaster. A horrendously deformed, non-viable, Picasso-esque face. Eyes, mouths, nasal placodes, all growing in the wrong places. The script was broken, so the output should have been broken.
And what actually happened?
What actually happened is that the organism, with its randomly scrambled facial parts, did not just follow that broken path. The tissue collective, acting as this integrated agent in Morphospace, initiated a massive, active, corrective process.
What do you mean, corrective process?
The cells migrated. They moved through novel, non-programmed paths, sometimes taking these really long, winding routes across the developing face, until they found their correct final anatomical positions.
The key word there is novel. The path was new. They weren't just correcting a small error. They were navigating a completely new, challenging landscape to get to the right goal.
Precisely. They were actively working to minimize the error between their current chaotic state and the global target, a normal tadpole face. It's this profound demonstration that the tissue collective can perceive the error and then deploy its distributed resources to fix it.
So face assembly isn't a pre-programmed sequence.
It's a dynamic, collaborative, problem-solving exercise by a collective intelligence.
That sounds almost like magic. But the MCA says this is just what you'd expect. And to validate this, researchers went to computers, right? In silico validation with neural cellular automata, or NCAs.
That's right. NCAs are basically computational systems where you simulate cells and you specifically give them local decision-making abilities. They're artificial agential matter in a digital world. The whole point was to see if giving subunits local intelligence actually provides an evolutionary advantage.
So what happened when you task these NCAs with, say, growing a specific pattern and then defending it against attack?
The results were immediate and powerful. They were a perfect computational validation of the MCA. The systems built with agential matter evolved significantly faster than the control systems built with passive, dumb components.
Why faster?
Because the system doesn't need to encode a brittle, centralized instruction set for every single component. Evolution just needs to select for the high-level rules that help the local problem-solving. It simplifies the search space enormously.
And what about robustness? Did they break when you introduced new kinds of damage?
They showed what's called morphostatic robustness. They held their shape even when they were exposed to noise or damage they had never been explicitly trained or evolved to handle. If you digitally cut a structure grown by an NCA, the competent virtual cells automatically see the deviation and start self-repairing. They fill in the damage and maintain the form.
So it confirms that distributed agency just inherently leads to systems that are resistant to failure.
And capable of handling novelty, yes.
And this research, it fundamentally changes our ideas about the new speed of evolution. The old view was that evolution had to be this incredibly tedious process.
Right. You had to find a perfect genetic mutation that dictated the precise placement of every single cell. It's incredibly slow and complex.
But the MCA view offers this massive shortcut.
It does. If the parts, the cells, the tissues, the gene networks are already competent experts at solving their own local problems, then evolution doesn't need to redesign the whole machine. It just needs to find a subtle signal that nudges those existing experts toward a new collective goal.
This is the critical shift. Evolution goes from changing the physical hardware to changing the informational software.
Exactly. I mean, think about the difference between having to physically rewire a complex robot versus just changing one line of code in its mission file.
It's night and day.
It is. If you want a new morphology, like a wider head or an extra finger, the old model says you need thousands of coordinated genetic mutations. The MCA model says you might only need to change the high-level bioelectrical pattern, the software template, that defines the goal state.
And the underlying genetic hardware stays mostly the same.
Mostly the same, but the overall developmental path can change instantly. This means evolution can now explore the software of life-changing goals and signals through these bioelectrical shifts, instead of being limited to the incredibly slow mutation-by-mutation exploration of the hardware of proteins and structures.
The potential for accelerated change is just massive.
It gives us a really elegant explanation for things like the Cambrian explosion, these sudden shifts in the fossil record, where complex new body plans appear much faster than you'd predict from gradual gene-by-gene change. A simple change in a voltage gradient could reorganize vast amounts of competent tissue almost instantly.
So the multi-scale competency architecture is clearly much more than just some esoteric biological theory. It's a unifying concept.
Yeah.
And it has these seismic implications for medicine, for engineering, for AI,
Yeah.
and maybe most profoundly for the philosophy of mind.
It really does. Let's start with Frontier 1. Medicine. The whole approach to medicine has to shift if you accept that tissues aren't passive matter, but they're actively communicating goal-seeking agents.
Yeah, you have to move away from this paradigm of obsessively micromanaging molecules. Trying to tweak one protein here or block one enzyme there.
And you move toward communicating with the tissue-level agents themselves. If we can learn to speak their language, the language of bioelectricity, we could issue high-level architectural instructions instead of just low-level component fixes.
The applications in regenerative medicine alone are just staggering.
They are. Instead of trying to genetically engineer a complex limb, piece by piece, which is basically impossible, you could simply provide the correct electrical template, the goal state, in Morphospace, and then you just trust the existing competent tissue to handle the self-assembly.
We go from being molecular mechanics to being tissue architects.
That's a great way to put it.
And this also critically reframes how we understand diseases like cancer. We tend to view cancer as just a molecular problem, a few rogue cells with bad mutations.
But the MCA sees cancer as a fundamental breakdown of collective intelligence. It's a failure of communication within the tissue hierarchy. Cancer cells are cells that they've regressed.
They've abandoned the global goal.
They've abandoned the Morphospace goal, the perfect organ structure, and they've reverted to solving a much more primitive, selfish problem. Just maximal survival in physiological space. They become incredibly competent at surviving locally, at proliferating, at metabolizing, but they've totally failed in their civic duty to the organism.
They refuse to listen to the geometric signals that define the boundaries of the organ.
Precisely. And if you see cancer as a cognitive failure, a failure of the collective to maintain its global goal, then treatment starts to shift. It's not just about killing those cells anymore.
It's about restoring the collective intelligence.
Exactly. The goal becomes restoring the proper bioelectrical signaling that reminds the tissue what it's supposed to be building, hopefully nudging those cancerous cells back into the global collective.
Okay, so Frontier 2 is engineering and AI. The MCA is already inspiring a revolution here, especially with things like the xenobots.
Right. Xenobots are built by taking biological, hardware-like frog skin and cardiac cells and just assembling them into new configurations. You don't program them with code. You just put the components together, and their own inherent competence causes them to self-organize into new functional forms.
And they achieve goals.
They achieve goals, they move on their own, they can carry tiny payloads, they can even self-heal if you cut them.
Which suggests a future for AI and robotics where we stop writing brittle, complex code and we start assembling agential components and just setting up the landscape, the incentives for them to solve the problem themselves.
It's a radically biological approach to engineering. You offload the complexity of the computation onto the problem-solving ability of the material itself. You just define the attractor, and the agential matter finds its way there.
And this leads us, inevitably, to Frontier 3, the philosophy of mind and the grand question.
Right. The MCA forces us to radically expand our definition of what intelligence even is and where it can be found.
Because if intelligence is just defined as the capacity to navigate a problem space toward a goal, toward an attractor, despite problems,
then you have to conclude that intelligence is not just for things with brains. It's fundamentally distributed across every single layer of biology.
So intelligence is a continuum. It just manifests differently at each scale. Morphospace intelligence is about geometry. Transcriptional space intelligence is about chemical balance.
But they're all forms of goal-directed competency, which makes a cell just as much of an intelligent agent in its own domain as a conscious human is in the behavioral domain.
The common thread is the ability to model the world and act to minimize the error between where you are and where you want to be.
It's an idea that is so eloquently captured in this one conclusion from the researchers, which I think just anchors the whole framework. It reminds us, Biology is not just a solution to a problem. It is a machine that is evolved to solve problems.
Wow. That phrase is a total shift. It means life's core ability isn't just to maintain its current state, but to maintain the capacity to adapt and learn and persist across all these different scales of challenge. It's a meta-solver. The goal of life is competence itself. What a completely transformative deep dive into the multi-scale competency architecture.
It really is a lot to take in.
I think the core takeaway we've really uncovered is that by understanding the competencies of the parts, by finally recognizing the inherent intelligence and problem-solving nature of every single component,
We gain a fundamentally new and powerful set of tools to influence the whole organism, from medicine to evolution.
it moves us away from seeing ourselves as these complex but ultimately passive clockwork machines.
And toward recognizing ourselves as these decentralized societies of competent agents, all coordinated by these subtle, high-level informational templates, like bioelectricity.
The goal isn't rigidly coded in the genes, it's dynamically maintained in the informational landscape.
That's it.
And I think this recognition leaves us with one final, provocative question for you to consider based on all these philosophical implications. If intelligence is really defined by the capacity to navigate a problem space toward an attractor, what other systems in the universe, systems that we currently see as non-biological, as purely passive?
Things like geological processes or complex weather patterns or even purely chemical reactions.
Exactly. Could any of them be exhibiting their own forms of competency and agency that we have simply failed to recognize, all because they don't happen to possess a brain?